So I'm Nils, and yeah, we do motion capture. And normally when people do motion capture, they put their subject into a suit, put some dots on it, be it LEDs or reflective spheres, and then they put some special cameras around the scene that record just the motion of these dots, and from the motion of these dots, they reconstruct the motion of the underlying skeleton. And we do essentially the same thing, just we don't use suits, and we don't use markers, we just use RGB cameras. And that has a bunch of advantages, like it's much easier to work with. It's faster in setup time, that's the main advantage for some of our customers. And yeah, so that's our background essentially. And today, like the first thing I'm going to talk about is like, how do you create an embodied experience? So for me, that's actually the big goal of virtual reality is to transport you into a different world and make you feel that you're there and that you have your own body, essentially. Right, so what does it take? The first thing you need is like a scene. This is some random 360 video I found on the internet. And you need to allow the person to look around in that scene. So normally you just take a part of that video and you allow the person to look around. And that's essentially it. It's fairly straightforward to take that to stereo. That way you also get depth information. But both of these approaches have or the generic 360 video approach has one massive disadvantage, which is the assumption they make is that when you rotate your head, this happens around the eyeball. But this is not what's actually happening. What's happening is that you do it with your spine, and the spine sits kind of in the back of your head. So what happens when you rotate is that you actually have some transitory, transitory motion in your, this is supposed to loop. Anyway, so you have some transitory motion, and that means that things that are closer to you actually appear to move more than things that are farther away. And you can easily see that with this, with the tower of that church, which moves in front of the background. And this is something that you don't get with 360 videos. So there is a company that actually records 360 videos that allows you to do that. They're called HypeVR. And it's really, really awesome what they do, but the setup they use is actually really, really expensive. So this is the setup they have. It's 14 Red Dragon cameras. Those are high-end film cameras and a LiDAR. So my estimate of the cost of the raw setup without optics is $1 million US. And so that's not what most people will want to use in the end, I guess. So in any case, what this gives you is a sense of location. So you feel that you're there, you can look around, but that's not all you want to do with the virtual reality experience, especially if you want to actually make it the highest level of embodiment. So what else do you need? You need to interact with the world. And most of our interactions we do in the real world happens with hands. So you need some kind of hand tracking, finger tracking. And there are a bunch of solutions out there. The simplest ones are the controllers that HTC Vive and Oculus and PlayStation VR and all the other manufacturers make. Then there are some gloves. We're going to hear more about the Manus gloves in the next talk. But there are some other options as well. And that actually gives you a sense of agency. So you're able to do something in the world. You're not just observing it. Like with a 360 video, you can just look around. But you're actually kind of doing something and interacting with the world. And the third component you need to be embodied is you need a body. And that's actually the most tricky bit to get right. And there are a bunch of options for that as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, more or less. Right, so we have a sense of body ownership. That's what it's called. So how do we implement such a system? If we want to actually go all the way and build a system that makes you feel that you're there and that you have a body and you're able to work with the world that you're presented with. So looking around is fairly easy. We just use the IMUs that are built in on all headsets. And we get really low latency and fairly good accuracy, especially if you combine it with the tracking devices that some of them also have. Second one, I actually already showed you most of these options. Interaction, normally you'd use a controller. Probably the easiest to use is the leap motion that you attach to the headset. You kind of just put on your headset and then you have your hands. It has some disadvantages as well, but it's very easy to use. And yeah, finally you need a body, and that's actually the most tricky bit. So there's this system, or there used to be the system because organic motion is not anymore. So they put up a bunch of cameras around the world, and that record the 3D geometry of the person into space. And that way you essentially get a virtual body that looks exactly like you do, which is good in some cases. It's not so good in some other cases, like if you want to actually have a game and you're some badass soldier and you see yourself, may not be what you want. Right, so another option that's actually fairly commonly used is to use inverse kinematics. So we already track the head because we want to look around and we kind of want to lean over a little bit. And we track the hands, and from that we can actually kind of reverse engineer where the elbows are probably at. And that works reasonably well. So Facebook did some studies on that, and they said it works really well for other people in your scene. So if you are in a virtual world and there's some other people in there, then you can easily do inverse kinematics for these other people because it looks plausible. And it doesn't really matter whether the elbows are here or here. But for your own body, if you look down, or even just the feeling of your muscles, you know where your elbow is. And if it doesn't match, then this is something that throws you off. So Facebook recommends not doing that for your own body, but only for other people. Nonetheless, it's a fairly easy and cheap option of getting reasonably good motion quality. Then you can go one step higher, and you can actually attach markers again. OptiTrack recommends putting markers on a vest or on your torso essentially, on a head, on the headset, and on some interaction device. They recommend a gun of some sorts, but maybe other things may be more suitable depending on your application. Vicon actually recommends using a full bodysuit. That way they get really the full motion. So OptiTrack still has to do inverse kinematics for the elbows and the feet because they don't have markers there, so then they don't know what's going on. So Vicon proposes to use markers all over the place, which has the advantage that you get really high quality for the motion, but the disadvantage that you have to put on a suit again. So that's really inconvenient. Then you can go with IMU systems. So the most common or the most well-known ones are XSense and Perception Neuron, but there are others. And they have the advantage that you don't have to instrument your world. So you don't have to put up 100 cameras in your gigantic capture space. But you still have to put on a suit or attach some markers somehow to your body. So that may also be very inconvenient. I mean, it always depends on the application. If you want something where people just jump in and do something for 5 minutes, you don't really want them to have to suit up. But if it's actually a long experience, and you can actually make it part of the experience that you put on the suit or something. That's another option. Then there's a very low-cost option to use some kind of Kinect or a depth camera base, so the RealSense, for example, or Orbeck Astra. So they track the motion from a depth camera. Normally the disadvantage is that the volume that you can track with that is fairly small, like a couple meters in all directions. Kinect has an additional disadvantage that the latency is really high. So I read a paper recently that said that for body motion, the latency should be less than 150 milliseconds. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like your own body anymore. So in my experience, 150 milliseconds is too long. It starts to feel laggy or bad long before that, but after 150 milliseconds, I can imagine that it doesn't feel like your own body anymore. And that's the worst case. Right. There's one additional disadvantage. it's very hard to extend the volume by putting more of these cameras in the same volume because they start to interfere with each other. So we come to the final solution to all these problems. We use RGB cameras. We don't have to prepare the subjects. You can just step in. You can do arbitrarily large volumes if you have enough cameras and enough processing power. And we can do fairly low latency. So we've done such a demo 2 years ago at FMX with A4 VR. And yeah, we had 8 cameras set up, and you could kind of see your own body in a virtual world. So this was done with Unreal, but it doesn't really matter, as you know. And I actually thought, so in my experience, it actually adds something to the realism of a lot of the virtual reality experiences that you see, because you have your own body and it feels like it's your own body. So I think it's actually a big step forward. Right. All right. So in the final part, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the technical details. How does our tracking work, and why is it so much better than what has been done in the past? So the classical approach for doing markerless motion capture assumes that you have a picture of the scene when it's empty, and then you just compare the picture of the empty scene with the picture of the scene with the person, and then you say, all right, this must be the person because it's not in the other image. And then you have a virtual model of your person, and you also compare that to the silhouette that you just extracted, and you find the closest point of your virtual silhouette with a measured silhouette, and that gives you like a little optimization gradient, and then you can kind of do some numerical optimization, and then you get the pose. So this is all really good as long as the silhouettes are good. So this is actually more or less how organic motion used to do it, and that's also why they had to have these very instrumented volumes. So they had a green floor and white walls and perfect lighting. And yeah, so that works really well when you have such an environment, but it's very impractical, I think, in many cases. Right, so then you get your model. So the next step is to still use silhouettes, so it's still a bit unstable. You render them again, and you render the silhouette of your person. But then you don't compute the differences in the gradients, like in the edges, but you actually just count the pixels that don't match. And that is a much more stable energy function, but it's also much harder to optimize, so you need really slow optimization methods. You sometimes see that as well. I think iPi uses something similar to that. That's another markerless motion capture company. So that's where we started essentially, and we said, all right, we want the pixel counts because it's more stable than the other method, but we want something that also gives us a derivative, so we can optimize it well. So we used the standard function that everyone uses for modeling pretty much anything, the Gauss function. And we said the image is actually a bunch of little 2D Gauss functions, and the person is a bunch of spheres, like 3D Gauss functions. And when we project the two, like the 3D Gaussian into the image, we get a 2D Gaussian, and the overlap of that is also a 2D Gaussian. And that's it. So this is the pipeline. We have the model, like the skeleton model, and the blobs that are the volume representation of our person. And we kind of have to learn, in an initial step, we have to learn what the person looks like that we want to track. And then we have the image, and we find regions that have the same color, and we transform those into 2D Gaussians as well. And then we can run our optimization, and we get the motion of the skeleton as output. So that's essentially all we do. There are a few little tricks that I'm not going to talk about, but that's essentially the gist of it. Yeah, there's more results. So this is one of my favorite results. So this was a sequence I captured in the very beginning, and I was like, all right, if we can track this, then we're done. So there are no cameras under the table. They're all above the ground at least chest height or something. Yeah. So in this video, you see the initial. So that was just the initialization of a person. Let me just get back and get forward. So this is how we initialize a new person. So you kind of have to stand there for 10 seconds. And then you can already see on the monitor, it's already tracking him. And yeah, we can do reasonably fast motion as well. It's a bit hard to see on the monitor, but he's being tracked. Yeah, and so on. And that's actually all I have. Thank you very much.